Welcome everyone to the session of today on what policy space for responding to climate migration. Today we're going to have three presentations. The first one by Mohamed Sisay, who is a MS student in Environment and Sustainability at the University of Michigan. Then we also have a presentation by Genevieve Mainville, a PhD candidate in human geography at York University and a research specialist at the Center for Expertise on Wellbeing and Physical Health on Refugees and Asylum Seekers, CERDA. We have lastly a presentation by Ms. Apemi Betts, technical advisor from ECOWAS on the component of the GIZ Global Program on HMCC. So thanks to all of you for your presentations and for joining us, to all of the attendees. We will begin our session with the presentation by Mr. Mohamed Sisay. So Mr. Mohamed, the floor is yours.
Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Mohamed Sise. I am a fourth-year master's student in environment and sustainability from the University of Michigan. So today I'll be talking about micromobility and the dynamics that create social differentiations of micromobility in the Gambia. So just to give some background and context, back in 2023, I did a field work in the Gambia, and I was examining how a particular climate-related hazard, saltwater intrusion, is affecting riparian rice farmers in the Gambia and how they are using micromobility as a way to adapt to that particular hazard. So I spent 8 weeks in the field, interacting with the local farmers there, and then try to understand these various differences or various scales of micromobility and how they serve as way of helping them to adapt to the climate hazard or the saltwater intrusion, to be specific. So I want to start by saying that a lot of time the emphasis of the climate-related migration or climate-related mobility discourse is centered around examining long-distance migration in the context of environmental change or climate change. And a little attention has been paid to the micromobilities that happen as a way of responding to climate or environmental changes. And I think this is where my study really would contribute to the scholarship or to the discourse, because I was able to bring to light how small scale mobility or people moving every day or people moving seasonally or weekly or bi-weekly serve as a way of creating buffers for themselves as they access other forms of livelihoods beyond their primary source of livelihood. So, for example, in the Gambia, I looked at the rice farmers, and then because the local rice sector is a major provider of livelihood for the farmers, when it was highly impacted by saltwater intrusion, a lot of the farmers started to pivot towards um, other forms of livelihood that would require them to be moving every day between communities. That's some sort of intercommunal mobility, and also moving to other fields that are more fertile for agricultural production. But then one thing that stood out was the idea of the farmers taking advantage of the existence of weekly markets in the Gambia. Weekly markets locally called lumos, where farmers go a lot of times to access or to engage into petty trade, into small scale businesses that would supplement or serve as a buffer against this decline in rice production. So, but then within this mobility, within these micro forms of micro mobilities, is the concept, is the notion of some social differentiations that happen. So basically, what I'm saying here is, even though micromobility or moving to other communities and other fertile lands seasonally or weekly or every day to access other livelihoods was a big provider of buffer to the farmers. A lot of them were obstructed or were impeded by some pre-existing social vulnerabilities to access those opportunities. For example, and then the idea of gender here came into play. For example, the women farmers had a very hard time traveling to other communities and also leasing land in other communities to practice agriculture or to even go to the weekly markets to conduct businesses because of the restricting social roles and norms that is in their way. For example, a woman I remember telling me that I know there are opportunities that exist beyond the community. I know I can go to the Lumos and practice the weekly markets and buy and sell and have some sort of income to help myself and my family, but I cannot do so without the consent of my of my husband in particular. And then until he tells me go, I can go. So trying to paraphrase her here, um, that the approval has to come from the husband for them to go. So there's a limited agency in short for women to be able to practice this sorts of micromobility. Um, and then aside from the social rules or the social norms restricting the agency of women, for example, to be able to access these forms of micromobility to buffer their livelihoods, there's also the question of wealth. And then also and this talks about the farmers who had access to means of mobility like donkey carts, horse carts, or private vehicles or motorbikes were more mobile than the ones who did not have that, which is kind of obvious, but then it again speaks into the question of um, the contours of inequality in rural societies, right? Even though they are all facing the same sort of hazard or disaster, there are some um, dynamics in who has access to what and how those access to those particular means of mobility support a person to be able to cope with this particular hazard. And then so the farmers that had most of these means of mobility were mostly male farmers because they control a lot of the resources that exist within the households. And another thing that also came up during the study was the idea of the question of labor, because the communities I did my study had been highly affected by sulfur intrusion, but there are other communities that are not as much affected. And then some of the farmers are able to travel seasonally to those nearby communities to practice to grow rice or to grow other crops. But then to go there, you need labor at your disposal, enough labor, sufficient labor at your disposal. Not only labor, but you also need transportation, like I mentioned in the beginning. So the farmers, like the male farmers who actually had a lot of control of the household labor, were able to leverage that to extend their agricultural activities beyond beyond their communities. And then again, you look at it, there a lot of times women did not have good control of the household labor to be able to engage in those sort of livelihood enterprises. So lastly was the question of social relations between between communities. Like some of the farmers who had good social ties in the other communities were able to travel to those communities more often to be able to practice whatever they wanted to practice to earn a livelihood. But those who did not have those relations in other communities could not do that. And this was mostly found among people who are considered as the settlers or maybe the outsiders who are not original settlers of the community. So the people who were living in the community for, or who believed to be the original settlers of the community, had stronger social ties outside their communities than those who are considered to be invited or foreigners, for example, if I can use the term. So basically, the overall idea here in my study is that micromobility can also be a side of inequality. Even though micromobility or small scale mobility, everyday, seasonal, weekly, can create buffers for farmers that are facing particular climate hazard, within that spectrum of mobility, you will realize that you will see some very stark inequalities interplaying. All right, and I think this is a question for policy, for the policy community to try to also consider that yes, micromobility can be a way of helping farmers to adapt, or even not only farmers, but anybody or any community that is facing a climate or environmental change. Micromobility can be a buffer or can serve as a means towards addressing or coping with that particular hazard. But within the spectrum of micromobility, also, there are some contours of inequality that need to be considered. And these have to, policies might have to consider, bringing some social programs that are geared towards transforming the gender dynamics in communities, right? And also supporting the internal community livelihoods, so as to prevent the friction that happens when people are trying to move out, especially those who are living in communities that value their culture so much so that, for example, women would not want to force their way out and travel without the approval of their husbands. So it would be a good idea to try to invest a lot into promoting or expanding or diversifying the livelihoods within communities to ensure that those frictions don't happen, which can eventually break social fabrics. So yeah, basically this is what my story was about, and I wanted to come and share with you all. It's longer than this, but I know we're time's constraint, so I tried to just put it in this summary. All right, thank you very much. I'll be open to answering any questions about this particular study. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Mohammed, for this very, very interesting presentation. We would definitely love to hear more from you and your work later in the Q&A session. We will now move on to our next presentation by Genevieve Mainville. So Genevieve, I give the floor to you. Feel free to share your screen.
Thank you. So I'll just try to share.
Genevieve, yeah, we can see all your notes, so perhaps you want to try and stop sharing and share again.
Right. 1 second. It worked earlier, but okay. Is it okay now?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay.
Yeah, it works.
Great. So thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And that was great to also hear Mohammed presentation. I think there's a couple of things, especially in the first part of my presentation, that will probably speaks to other presentation as well. So as mentioned, I'm a PhD candidate at York University that's located in Toronto, Canada, and I'm also a research specialist at the CERDA. I'll have the chance to talk a little bit more about that later. But I really just wanted to say, though, before we do that, that I'm located right now in Toronto. It's a city built on stolen land, including the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And as you will see in my discussion today, I'll be talking about climate migration, pretty much in a way informed by critical theories that highlight the role of power structures in producing forms of mobility. So I won't be discussing per se like internal migration happening in North America, but it's very important for me to take a minute to just acknowledge that such forms of internal mobility also happen here in Canada and in the US, and that the indigenous communities are being disproportionately impacted. And this is not just because of geographical location, but rather because of the result of longstanding and ongoing settler colonialism structures of power. Okay. So today I'll draw on my PhD research as well as my work at the CERDA to explore two ends basically of climate migration, so the pre-migration and the post-migration stages. So overall, you'll see that I'll argue that climate mobility should not be tackled solely through legal perspectives, and that both pre-migration and post-migration stages offer some insights into flexible policy responses to this form of mobility. So put differently, although discussions around the legal recognition of climate mobility are obviously very important, I want to argue that we do not have to wait for legal recognition to take actions, and that there are other pathways, other spaces to explore to ultimately better help the people that are affected. And before I jump into the topic, I also want to note that the argument of my presentation today is intended to focus mostly on policy actions in cases of mobility across international borders, so very different from Mohammed presentation. And in that case, Canada is used as an example of host country. However, and obviously this is very important to also mention, as you'll see in the first part of my presentation, climate mobility is much more complex and diverse, and there's many other forms of mobility occurring internally as well. It's actually the form of climate mobility that we often see the most, so without even crossing any borders. So I'll start by discussing the pre-migration stage, and then I'll move on with the post-migration stage. So let's start by traveling a little bit to the Philippines for a couple of minutes. So let's go to Zambales, which is actually a province in the northern of the Philippines in the central Luzon. So you have like on the screen, you can see where it's located. And if we zoom in a little bit, so this is what you see on the right side of your screen, then we see the two municipalities of San Felipe as well as Botolan. That's where my research for my PhD took place. So I went to these two municipalities and I met with communities and activists from there. And then if we zoom in a little bit more, we see as well the two rivers. So basically, both municipalities of San Felipe as well as Botolan are located at the river's mouth of two of Zambales' biggest rivers, which is the Bucao River and the Santo Tomas River. So these two rivers are quite particular because they're very dense with volcanic sediments, which is a result basically of the Mount Pinatubo eruption from in June 1991. As well, that was like the biggest event, as well as the subsequent lahar flows, so the sand coming from volcanic sediments from Pinatubo flowing through the rivers until they reach the sea. So even if it happened actually 3 decades ago, the geography of Zambales and the ecology and ecosystems of these rivers are still very much related to what happened in 1991, and sand is very much still a big feature of this place. Though the flows that used to happen in the rivers during typhoon seasons stop being so frequent. Now, you might already be aware of that, but today the Philippines is also among the most at risk of climate change impacts, with increasing disasters, including typhoons. And how is that impacting Zambales? So let's first consider these two articles, which are quite typical of what you'll normally see in the news if you read about the topic from the government perspective. So we see lahar sand, lahar refers to sand, lahar sand threatens 3 Zambales down. So it is critical to prevent further overflow and flooding. So dredging is important to urge as 4.7 billion cubic meters of lahar sand threaten Philippines towns. So dredging is the option that is being used here, as the Philippines faces increasingly severe weather patterns that could trigger devastating floods if the lahar clogged waterways overflow during heavy rainfall periods. So from this perspective, if we look at, what we've just read, what we're trying to do is basically trying to find a solution to those future risks, which we could call a climate adaptation solution to a problem that is both related to natural processes happening in with the lahar sand flowing in the rivers, combined with the ongoing pressure of climate change, making typhoons more frequent, more intense, and thus causing these flows to be more intense. And if we look at the definition of environmental migrants from the International Organization of Migration that you are probably all aware of, so that the environmental migrants are people who move because of sudden or progressive changes in the environment that adversely affect their lives or living conditions. We might be tempted to capture what's happening in Zambales as a future risk of environmental migrants, right? So if I just told you what I just told you, and just we look at the definition, that it might seem like, this is what's happening or this is what's going to happen. And the truth is, People are indeed already starting to migrate and move in forms of micro-mobility, as Mohammed was mentioning, within the province or maybe neighboring provinces, but mostly within the province. And that's because indeed of the adverse changes that are occurring in their environment. But the thing is, and that's the twist, the reason of their departure is not the flows and flooding of lahar sands in the rivers. It's the ongoing destruction of the environment, the erosion of the coast where they live that completely destroy their houses, and the disruption of the ecosystem that prevent them from fishing and therefore force them to find other livelihood opportunities elsewhere. And these are all related to dredging. So dredging of sand that is, again, being done in the name of climate, adaptation, if we like river rehabilitation to be exact, that's how they call it. Dredging of sand that is also being transported to Manila City, so the capital of the Philippines, for reclamation projects that just further destroy ecosystems and displace people as well. So having said that, my argument today with you for that part is that we should be careful in the ways we frame and respond to climate mobility. So if we adopt an apolitical and ahistorical approach, we could say that communities in Zambales face future climate displacement risk and that we need action to reduce those risks. But we can also see how the word climate can actually easily become a scapegoat that legitimizes some actions informed by structures of power. In the case I just shown, climate risk combined with the natural processes of lahar sand flows became an opportunity basically that could easily be framed under climate change adaptation, rehabilitation, and overall safety and protection of people. But the environment is always co-produced, right, by natural processes and human action. So it's always a co-production. And I argue that this is important to consider how other factors, including political and economic structures of power, shape spaces of vulnerability to climate change that put people at risk of being displaced. And before I explain how, this is important for flexible policy decisions, let's come back to Canada. So to go to the province of Quebec, as well as to the post-migration stage. So not so much focusing on the causes anymore, but rather on the impacts of climate migration. So as mentioned earlier, and as you heard in the introduction, I also work at the CERTA as a research specialist. So the CERTA is the Center of Expertise on the Well-being and Physical Health of Refugees and Asylum Seekers in Quebec. We are part basically of the health services offered here. Well, the health system of Quebec. So one of our mandate is to make recommendation to the Ministry of Health and Social Services of Quebec. So we are mandated by the ministry. And we have to make a recommendation on issues related to the health of refugees and asylum seekers that are resettling in the province, as well as to support health practitioners that work with migrants when they arrive here in Quebec, and they have to have their health assessment. So we support these health practitioners, including, coming from physical health professionals, but also mental health and social workers professionals. So at the CERDA, of course, we knew that, refugees and asylum seekers could not be accepted because of climate factors, as it's not recognized by international law. But we still wondered how the migration journey of forced migrants coming to Quebec might still be impacted by climate and environmental change. So with the help of an advisory board, we met with refugees and asylum seekers and discussed with them how climate and environmental change might have impacted their migration. This led us to create our podcast, Précipitation, which is in French. But if you do speak French, I encourage you to go and listen to it. It's on Spotify and Apple Music. So you'll hear real stories of people. Following the podcast, we made some recommendation to the Ministry of Health and Social Services of Quebec. So basically, we did not want to fall into the mindset of being unable to take action or support climate migrants because there is no legal status recognizing such migration. Instead, we discussed ways migration happen in the context of climate and environmental change. So to do that, rather than treating climate change as an exceptional cause of migration and looking at it strictly as a cause, that allowed us to view it as like a context within which migration unfolds. So it just really broadened basically our horizons and our way of understanding it. So that helped us to move beyond definition debates and to look for flexible actions that the Ministry of Health and Social Services could actually put in place to better support the health and well-being of the refugees and asylum seekers who, at the end of the day, no matter their cause of migration, might still have faced the impacts of climate change at various stages of their migration. And this is super important. So not just as a cause again, but also while they migrated, but also even when they arrive here, because climate change doesn't stop in Quebec and in Canada. They can still face some impacts from it. And this led us to do this last step that we just finished right now, actually, which is the creation of a training for health practitioners so that their work with refugees and asylum seekers are more climate sensitive as they consider the impacts of potential climate factors they face during the migration on their physical health and social services. And of course, the ultimate goal of doing that is really to improve the health services that are offered for refugees and asylum seekers once they come here, in consideration of this new reality that we all face, which is climate change. So in other words, we could say that we simply didn't wait for legal recognition of climate migration to train health practitioners to that reality. And we took action where we could, which is in this case in the health system, because it's our expertise. So let's wrap that up and see how those two examples can help us think of flexible, flexible responses, policy responses. So I gave you two different situations, right? So the pre-migration one in Zambales, Philippines, where there is a future risk of displacement, but it's partly related to climate cause. There's other cause at play, as well as the post-migration example in Quebec with the CERDA, where we focus on how to alleviate the impacts of forced migration in the context of climate change on people's health, despite climate factors not being recognized as a cause to claim refugees. So now, what can we learn from these two examples? So first, I argue that it is actually counterproductive to treat climate factors as exceptional. Rather, I argue that we should always consider how the environment is as a co-production of natural processes and human actions. Similarly, there are always other factors at play in climate migration, apart from climate factors, including political and economic factors. It makes more sense then, I argue, to find solutions and take action not only to alleviate climate pressures, but also to address the other factors that exacerbate them. And to do this, I argue that we need to move away from apolitical and ahistorical perspectives of climate mobility and considers the role of power structures, including colonialism and capitalism, in the creation of and reproduction, I would also say, of climate migration. Moreover, this allows us to see the complexity of migration. So rather than treating climate migration as exceptional, once again, we should ensure that all systems protecting migrants, broadly speaking, as well as the services offered to them, are climate sensitive. And understanding climate as a context of migration rather than as a cause of migration is helpful here and provides more space for policymakers to take action. At the same time, it allows us to consider all stages of migration, as I've mentioned before. So not just the departure, but we can also take action, that are aimed for people on the move. So for instance, while they are in refugee camps, or also while they are resettlement migrants who may face floods here or wildfires, or just, the really harsh winter that just makes it very hard for some people to adapt to. And finally, we should also find solutions in other systems beyond the legal system. So the health system, as I have shown, is a good place to start, I would argue, given the undeniable impacts of climate change and on climate change on people's health, on migrants' health, including physical health and mental health. So I hope and I invite you all to also think of perhaps other spaces beyond the legal systems and beyond the health system, as I've shown today, where this could also be done, because I believe there's a lot of hopes that lies into that. So thank you so much for listening, and you're most welcome if you want to stay connected with me. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Genevieve, for this very insightful presentation. We will now move on to the last presentation of today's session from Ms. Afhaimi Bits. So I give the floor to you to start your presentation.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'll just start by saying this is quite the opportunity. So thank you for having me on here. However, it's like midnight already. It's past midnight in Nigeria. So I'll try to be as quick as possible. And if there are any questions, I can take them after my presentation. If not, these questions can be mailed to me and I can do my best to answer as many questions as possible. So can you see my screen now? Yeah, so our work on the ECOWAS level is basically enhancing resilience to climate mobility in West Africa. Our project is a global project, human mobility in the context of climate change. And for us, we're the ECOWAS component. There's the component in Fiji and in the Philippines, and as well as in Germany, where we do most of the advisory. So I'll just start by really just giving a background to the ECOWAS. ECOWAS is a regional group, used to comprise of 15 African countries, if you're aware, that had signed a treaty comprising of Benin Republic, Burkina Faso, Cote d'Ivoire, the Gambia, Ghana, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Liberia, Mali, Mauritania, Niger, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Senegal, and Togo. This treaty was signed in 1975. However, on the 29th of January, 2025, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger officially withdrew from the ECOWAS, right? So the current member states of ECOWAS are Benin, Cabo Verde, Cote d'Ivoire, the Gambia, Ghana, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Liberia, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Senegal, and Togo. So now we have 3 countries which have left, and so we have 12 countries still under the ECOWAS. And this initially was the aim of the community, is to advance cooperation and integration with the goal of creating an economic union within West Africa. Now, in relation to HMCCC, ECOWAS offers support by promoting free movement, strengthening disaster preparedness, protecting vulnerable populations, and integrating migration into regional climate resilience and adaptation strategies. Again, I just tried to set the context. We can see the negative impacts of climate change and the conflicts. I mean, they're already influencing migration as it were today. Migration takes place within our borders, so within the national borders, or cross-border movement is also increasing within relevant ECOWAS regions. And at the same time, immobility poses a growing challenge. So because populations in the Sahel and coastal regions of West Africa are particularly hard hit by this. So, I mean, the global frameworks, as well as the ECOWAS regional climate strategy, which recognize climate change as a driver of migration, and migration as a climate adaptation strategy. And, you know, these frameworks are calling for solutions. Well, measures for dealing with human mobility in the context of climate change are actually vital, and which is why we try to engage as much as possible on the thematic area. So like I said earlier, the human mobility in the context of climate change, we have components in Fiji, Philippines, ECOWAS, which is Africa, and then in Germany as well. So we mostly know that, the World Bank's groundswell report has stated that over 32 million people in West Africa could be forced to move internally by 2050 due to slow onset climate impacts if urgent actions are not taken. Key drivers of climate-induced mobility within West Africa that we can see desertification, coastal erosion, and sea level rise, increased frequency of extreme weather events. So we've had cases of flooding, and all of this lead to food insecurity, which is again then linked to droughts and erratic rainfall patterns. So I've also included here a video to just show what ECOWAS is about, just for further information. Now, the objective of our component or of this module is the implementation of climate resilient and gender responsive approaches for human mobility in the context of climate change, to ensure that this is improved at the national, regional, and international levels. Okay, so we do this by one, capacity development of partner organizations. So for us, ECOWAS, and we work specifically with the Directorate of Free Movement of Persons and Migration, as well as the Directorate of Environment. So they are our key partners on the project. So we ensure that we develop tools and then trial them together with civil society, develop knowledge products that are gender responsive. We also have our city-centric HM3C approaches. Also, we have cooperation on international and regional processes. So in this case, we do things like the application of oriented concepts, produced for processes for our networks or civil society measures as well. And then, of course, we also provide advisory to the BMZ. Now, our areas of intervention include the facilitation of, we facilitate the coordination and collaboration, as well as agenda setting within the ECOWAS institutions and within the member states. We also support the improvement of collection, analysis, and dissemination of early warning data. This we do with the body called AgriMet, which is the ECOWAS Climate Center. We also strengthen capacities of the ECOWAS staff and relevant ECOWAS partners in member states to implement HM3C approaches. This we've done with ECOWAS a few months back. We had a training on human mobility in the context of climate change, basically to get to ensure that people really understand what we're talking about. We also provide support. We also provide support to civil society organizations, think tanks, to provide relevant input in regional and national policy processes on the thematic area of human mobility in the context of climate change. In this situation, we also have what we call what is called the MIDWA. Okay, so I believe the topic for me was what policy space is available for responding to climate migration. Like I stated earlier, there are some frameworks already in existence. So for example, the ECOWAS Regional Climate Strategy, we have the Free Movement of Persons, Residence and Establishment Protocol, there's the ECOWAS Disaster Risk Reduction Plan of Action. And then there's the platform called the Migration Dialogue West Africa, the thematic working group on migration, environment, and climate change. So that's the MIDWA TWG MEG. This was established in 2001. The Migration Dialogue for West Africa, which is a regional consultative process on migration within the ECOWAS, provides the opportunity to advance discussions and take action on migration, displacement, planned relocation, in the context of disasters, climate change, and environmental degradation within West Africa. And this platform was recently revived. I don't know if you can still see me or the power went out here.
Wait, we can still see you and we hear you.
Okay. So yes, this platform was recently revived because it had been dormant for a while. And in August, we were in Sali, Senegal, where we brought together member states and different establishments. So like the immigration were part of this, immigration officers were part of this meeting where the discussion on HMCCC was then presented again amongst the member states, and they were encouraged, and this brought about opportunities for member states to be able to include human mobility or climate mobility into their national policies. So countries made commitments to including climate mobility into their national adaptation plans and into their NDCs, because countries are now supposed to submit their NDC 3.0, which is the nationally determined contributions of the country. And so member states are now reviewing their NDCs and including climate mobility into their national policies. So this platform has given the opportunity for this discourse to actually be taken to a higher level, because some of the frameworks available, some of the policies may speak to migration. However, it is not explicitly stated. They can make mention to migration, but not in the context of climate change. And so this platform brought about the opportunity to be able to mainstream human mobility approaches into national policies. And so further to that, I believe critical policy questions which now arise from these meetings, a lot of member states, spoke about the legality and practicality of recognizing climate-related mobility while also protecting the rights of migrants and people who are moving. And then also for some people, for some member states, the question arose about mainstreaming mobility into their NDCs and into their NAPs with measurable indicators. So for some countries, they want to understand what exactly the measures are. And this we're trying to establish with member states by actually training them on what these approaches include. And so we had a technical workshop where member states were brought together. We had other partners from the IOM, where climate mobility was actually discussed again, and then the actual indicators that need to be seen in their national policies. So what kind of data is being gathered? We had agreement, like I said, who was like the data center, and they gather all of this data, but what the data doesn't speak to climate mobility. So even for them, it's about building a capacity to be able to collect the relevant data that actually speaks to climate mobility, that shows that, okay, this is the situation and this is how people are moving. Because without relevant data, without clear data information, we cannot say specifically that climate mobility is actually happening, because people are not able to show categorically how this is happening. And so capacity is being built, and then the question about financing mechanisms to support mobility sensitive adaptation also arose. And so I think these are some of the critical policy questions that can be taken further, and to also see how to include climate mobility approaches. So for us on the ECOWAS end, these are some of the things that we've done so far to bring climate mobility to the forefront, to ensure that climate migrants are actually being seen, and to ensure that it is even with a gender lens. So there's a lot of disaggregated data. How are we galvanizing these data? How are we distributing data? How are we communicating this data? And how can the data be trusted? So these are some of the work going on the ECOWAS end. Thank you.
Thanks to you, Pemi.
Course. Yes.
I was thanking you for finishing your presentation, even if your power went out. Luckily, you still have internet, correct?
Yes, I still do have
Okay,
internet,
so you still
yes.
can join us for the Q&A session.
Yes, I'm still available for a few more minutes before I have to actually go off.
It is not a
Off.
problem. I understand it's quite late for you. So perhaps in the interest of time and recognizing that you may have to log off soon, I have questions for the panelists, and I also encourage our participants or attendees to share your questions in the Q&A tool that we have and that you will see at the bottom of your screen. If you have any comments, if you have any questions, please feel free to share it there. I will address that one question to you, Pammy, regarding what you just mentioned. So in the context of ECOWAS, we know that this type of free movement and free mobility regimes are not easy to implement, and particularly not easy to implement across all member states. So I wanted to ask you, what is the level of implementation of the provisions that are included as part of the ECOWAS? And what have been some challenges in the implementation, as well as some opportunities to ensure that the mobility provisions are including climate mobility as an adaptation strategy, and that it can actually be used and enforced as an opportunity for member states when a disaster hits, for example. So if you could talk about level of implementation as well as challenges and opportunities.
So on the member state level, so member states have their response mechanisms for these disasters. So for like Nigeria, for example, you have the NEMA, you have these ministries that handle some of these things. In terms of implementation, they're not, like I said, so they have responses for early warning. They're able to disseminate this, give these warnings. Like, for example, when there were flooding incidents, information did go out. However, preparedness is quite lacking. The capacity to actually be there to rescue people, get them to a safe location. So there isn't that safe location. So there isn't like a place designated to say, okay, people can then move here. So in terms of infrastructure-wise, there's some gap there. The response time, there's also some gap there. So there are actually gaps in these processes. However, they do exist, but they're not as efficient as you would expect. Again, funding is an issue for some of these ministries and agencies that have to deal with response to climate issues, right? And so migrants do actually suffer. You do see the loss, people lose their lives, they lose virtually everything. Now, opportunities there now, like I mentioned earlier, for the member states would be then to actually come together and actually share. So what is happening is trying to ensure that people can actually move within the borders. So you have things like the ECOWAS Laissez-Passer, there's the biometric ID cards that are being developed, and like I would call it a trial phase. So when people have these biometric ID cards, they can easily go into neighboring countries. But for now, I think the opportunity is there to say, okay, how do we finance maybe the adoption of these biometric ID cards? How do we support member states in terms of improving their capacity to actually respond to climate migration issues? So there's a lot of opportunities, even as much as the gaps that do exist.
Thank you for that answer. We have another question in the chat for you. And it says that there are unique needs for people displaced from environmental disasters in ECOWAS versus other migrants that are or are not met after crossing borders?
I didn't get the question. Are there unique needs, did you say?
Yes, so from what I understand, the person is asking if there are unique needs from displaced populations in ECOWAS versus other types of migration, like labor migration, that are not being met after crossing international borders. So are there specificities with the people that are being displaced due to climate migration in comparison to people that are migrating for labor reasons, for example?
I think the specific needs, if I get the question correctly, would be, I mean, most of the people who are displaced by climate issues or due to climate change reasons still have, I think they have more needs than the people, labor migrants, because I mean, those who are migrating with their skills and going international or going elsewhere, most people actually get jobs and then they move, and some are able to move and then they get jobs where they move to. However, for people who are displaced due to climate change issues, many times they lose everything. So if they end up in camps, sleep on the streets, and so they have a lot of needs. So for some of them, even though they have skills, because most people are farmers, however, when they're displaced, they can't start farming on a street within the city, for example, until they're better able to be assimilated. And then even within the cities, most times they're not accounted for. We were in a meeting not too long ago where
Hello? Pammy, I think we lost you.
I think we may have lost Pemi given the power challenges, so perhaps we could move
Yes.
on until she's back.
Yes. All right. So perhaps she will be able to join later on. We will continue now with a question to Mohammed. So Mohammed, I would like for you to explain a little bit more about and based on your study about the fact that you presented that some farmers are having to move seasonally as a way of adaptation. So using micro mobilities, as you call them, as a way of adaptation, and that these there's two sides of the coin. This can work as a strategy for adaptation, but this can also generate inequalities. So I would like to ask you if you have any ideas on how these micromobilities can be better supported to ensure that when people move, they do it safely, they do it with dignity, and they can do it with enough resources to ensure that they're given a positive adaptation and integration experience. So could you talk us a little bit about that, about how could we support better support these type of mobilities? Mohammed, you're muted.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. I would start by saying that because these micro mobilities are mediated by social, economic, and cultural, as well as spatial factors, it is important to also look into investments that target these specific factors. For example, um, some of the farmers who moved seasonally from their communities to other communities had the means to do so because they had access to means of mobility, and also they had access to land elsewhere. And some of these lands were acquired through leases, right? And then those leasing contracts are kind of like structured in a way that favor people who have access to wealth and income. So, in other words, if you're a farmer, let's say a male farmer who is wealthy enough, who has enough money, you can simply move to another community that is less affected by salt water and lease land there because you have the money. So, I think a way of supporting these people that are unable to move seasonally to these communities to for their livelihood is to try to restructure the legal frameworks that govern the leasing agreements that exist within those communities. I know this can be done at a national, at different scales. It can be done at national level. It can be done at a regional level. Because, for example, the Gambia has a regional administrative system where every region is governed by an administration system that oversee the management of land sometimes. So here, a policy intervention could be, or a legal intervention could be, create a legal framework or a policy that ensures that acquiring land that is fertile for agricultural production doesn't have to pose a lot of bottlenecks for people, right? So restructuring those frameworks would be really, or initiating such frameworks can be really, really helpful. I think another thing that could be done, like I mentioned briefly in my presentation, was diversifying internal community livelihoods, right? That farmers do not have to travel seasonally or don't have to travel to other communities to be able to access the livelihoods that they need. For example, most of them were going to the weekly markets, and when it rained, they could not, or because they couldn't go because they don't have access to transportation. So I mean, finding ways of investing into the local economies of those communities will really be helpful to helping them stay at least. Because what is important here, the caveat here is that when climate related hazards hit or they happen in communities, not everybody moves. There's this concept, this notion of immobility, right? People might move, but they might not move for long distances, right? So you should also, because of fear of dislocating their from with their communities, or like this sense of attachment to their place that they live in. But then that again depends on the severity and then the magnitude of the hazard. But then all in all, I think it's important to invest in the local economies or community-based economies to diversify their livelihoods to create those buffers for them. So I don't know if that answers the question. Yeah.
It does. Thank you. And I will just recap from that it's important to understand the local needs and to think about providing resources and also at the local level, which I think is very, very interesting. So thank you for that answer. I now have actually two questions for Genevieve, because you presented on two different issues and two different types of work that you're doing. So the first one would be that on the work that you've done, you showed that climate displacement is driven not only by climate-related factors, but also by political and structural factors. So I wanted to ask you if you could share with us your thoughts on how can we get policymakers and decision makers to start seeing this not as a neutral climate issue, but start also taking responsibility and acknowledging their role on ensuring that people stop believing that this is an issue that they have to solve themselves, but taking accountability as well. So do you have any ideas on how can we also move that political will and that recognition that this is not necessarily just a climate and environmental driven situation? And the other question would be that you talked about climate-informed care for refugees and asylum seekers, and I would love to hear how does that look like in practice. So based on the trainings that you have been given, how does it look like in practice? Like what difference is there any difference between dealing with a person that has been displaced due to climate factors versus someone that has been displaced by political conflict, for example? So in practice, how that would look like. And those are my questions, Genevieve.
Thank you. Thank you for those very interesting questions. So in terms of the first one, like I would say, like my answer relates like more to how we can do it, how we can think about it differently in host communities. So not so much about like how, because that would be a really tough question to answer in terms of like how the government of the Philippines, for instance, could like acknowledge what's happening. Like I think this is like a very, again, like a very political thing happening that we have to look at like different structures that are of power that are global, to answer that question. So if I just go back to like maybe more a perspective here in Canada, for instance, or I mean any host communities that welcome international migrants, I would say, as I mentioned in my presentation, that I believe it's just really important to, improve the services and the programs that are offered to migrants, broadly speaking. So as opposed to have like, again, seeing like climate as something very exceptional, not that it's not important, but I'm just saying like, as opposed to like staying a little bit like stuck in those debates, to move forward and to just improve all services and to make sure that all services are climate sensitive. So by that I mean, I gave you the example, for instance, of refugees and asylum seekers, but there's other migration status, for instance, here in Canada, that we could definitely make sure to make more climate sensitive and climate inclusive, so that the services that are offered to those people, but also the services that are offered to those people are better equipped to respond to that needs. So I think that would also help to incorporate like how, like how different factors are playing, and seeing how migration at the end of the day is very complex. It's never just about one thing. It's like a lot of different things, and that's always been the case. The difference is that now climate change is like a global pressure that is very much more intense. But the environment has always been like a factor to take into consideration when looking at migration. So having that perspective and just making sure that all services are more climate sensitive, I think already kind of answer a little bit that need to move beyond it as like an exceptional thing. And in terms of the second question, so I mean, I suppose it's different from other places, but here how it works in Quebec is so refugees and asylum seekers, when they arrive, they need to go through health assessment that are specifically for their needs. So they do that to do that, they have to go through health practitioners that are mandated to help them specifically for that. So making sure that these services are climate sensitive, what that looks like is to consider again like all the different health needs that you can just forget about, or like not forget about, but like that you can have in your that can be forgotten if you don't take in consideration the climate lived experience of the people. So I'm trying to think of an example, but there's a couple of things that what we do with like one of the things that we did basically for the training is that we took like a case study, which was a case study built with the help of an asylum seeker and refugees who actually experience those things. And we just really, it's a real case study, but we just built on it to show how everything basically that person experience is also related to their experience of climate change. However, if the health practitioners are not asking questions specifically related to that, like as related to the fact that did you experience any climate factors, any disasters, any things like that, all those other health issues that might be related to those factors, to those climate factors, can just be forgotten or not seen, and that can cause like some issues, like people maybe having asthma because of the pollution that they suffered from, and then never having the help they need and the services they need and the care they need basically related to that issue. So things like that. So I hope that answers the question, but yeah, thank you.
It does. It's very interesting to understand how that would look like in practice in the field. So I want to thank all of our speakers as well as the attendees that joined this session. As a main takeaway, I would perhaps because we had such a diverse panelists and presentations, that I would say that the main takeaway is that we understand that migration and mobility is a multifactorial phenomenon, and especially even climate-driven migration is not solely driven by climate, but by other types of factors that should also be considered when implementing solutions, as well as when implementing and responding to climate mobility. Same as how this is a multifactorial phenomena, this requires a cross-sectorial and comprehensive response. Otherwise, anything that we try to do is going to fall short. So thanks to all of you again for these really insightful presentations. Thank you for joining, whether it is the afternoon, the evening. Thanks everybody for joining us, and we invite you to log in tomorrow because we have great presentations as well. Bye-bye.
Thank you.